Hello, you're listening to the West Cork History Festival podcast. For more about the festival and other recordings, go to our website at www.westcorkhistoryfestival.org. The recording you're about to hear was made at our festival in August 2024, and it is the historian Christopher de Bellaigue talking about his book, The Lion House, The Coming of a King, an extraordinary account of the life of Suleyman the Magnificent, and the first of 3 volumes in that series that he will produce. Christopher was fascinating and provoked all sorts of conversation and discussion at the festival last year. We hope you will enjoy listening to it again.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you everyone for coming today. Yes, I'm the token non-European. I was having a lovely swim this morning. I never realised that I would just be stepping straight into the boathouse in order to address you all. Thank you very briefly to Simon and Victoria for inviting me here. Thank you to the organisers for accepting the rather outlandish suggestion of having someone to talk to you about Suleyman the Magnificent in the West Cork History Festival, which, as I have surmised from the contents of the books table, is quite West Cork. But I have done my homework. I was reading with great pleasure a book called The Stolen Village, which is about the raid that was mounted on Baltimore in 1631. This is after Suleiman's time, but nonetheless it was by the Barbary Corsairs, and they took something in excess of 100 people from Baltimore, and they got them as far as Algiers, which was then in the hands of the Barbary Corsairs, and only 2 returned, and I think they returned through ransom. One of them was ransomed, and I think one of them escaped. But it is extraordinary, and I think somewhat reassuring to think that the reach of global forces was quite astonishing in those days. The Barbary Corsairs, as you may know, even got as far as Iceland. The Corsair that I've been dealing with, and for whom I have probably a perverse affection, is Barbarossa, who didn't in fact have a red beard, but his brother Oruch did. And so when Oruch died, they just gave him the same name, and he became the most feared pirate in the Mediterranean. He didn't get as far as here, but we'll have more to say about him later on. I'm going to give you an insight into the world of Suleyman the Magnificent, but also my conception of the world of Suleyman the Magnificent, because I came at it from a slightly oblique angle. As Simon mentioned, I've spent a lot of my time as a foreign correspondent and as a journalist, and in the days when such a life was financially feasible. And as any journalist should feel, I started to think that my knowledge of things was highly superficial because I was dealing with the here and the now, and people kept referring to events that I didn't know much about. And so I sort of gradually translated myself into a historian of one kind or another, dealing mostly with the 19th and 20th centuries, and very often in a slightly hectoring tone, addressing the British and other Western powers and on their mistakes in the Middle East. Suleyman is my first real foray into kind of removed or distant history, the history for which there is no remote possibility of talking to someone who ever talked to someone who even talked to someone who was involved. And yet my approach has been, in some ways, slightly journalistic. And I started the first book of what will end up a trilogy, Don't Groan, with sitting down at the beginning of lockdown with a gentleman called Marino Sanudo, who was a diarist, and he makes Pepys look like a dilettante. He essentially splurged everything that happened in Venice in the first decades of the 16th century onto the page, and then left it to posterity to decide what was worth looking at and what wasn't. And in my view, everything that Marino Sanudo put down was worth looking at. And I started to try and tease out the relationship between Venice and the Ottoman Empire at the time, Venice being essentially a place almost smaller than Central Park, but with an enormous range of interests and satellites, and slowly being swallowed by the Ottoman world hegemon. Now, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that relationship? You deal with it essentially with a very hard-nosed appreciation of your own interests. And so I wanted to start this story about Suleyman from the attitude and the perspective of the outsider, the man in the middle, as it were, because the Venetians were, in every sense of the word, a European power, but with so many Asiatic interests, they had to keep on the right side of the Ottomans, which got them into an enormous amount of trouble with their fellow Europeans. And so sitting down with Marino Sanudo and just sort of idly transposing, I suppose, what he was writing about certain meetings that had taken place in the Doge's palace, and these reports kept arriving about this new guy who was on the throne of the Ottomans and how powerful he was. I started to do so in really a journalistic frame of mind, and putting what Marino was writing in the present tense onto my page in the present tense. And I thought, well, I would change that later on and I would turn it back into the past tense. But by the time I came to do that, I realized that that journalistic approach, that sense of the here and now, had infused the way that I was writing the history. And so it didn't seem like a sensible thing to do. And so that is what I've continued to do. And so the books are written in the present tense, but they are written as you will have appreciated, with a very strong tie to the primary sources. And so that goes as far as the Turkish sources and the Persian sources and various other sources that I've managed to get together at this time. For those of you who were in the talk earlier, and I'm sure you all were, the decline of history and the challenge that faces historians nowadays, and they are manifold and manifest, but one of the great advantages is that I could do an enormous amount of research into primary sources, sitting in the top room of our house for the duration of lockdown, which was an intensely liberating and also rather strange experience. So why Suleyman, and who is Suleyman? There is no reason why most people here should have very much idea about who he was, or indeed why he should attract the attention of a modern historian. He was the Ottoman Sultan whose reign coincided with the greatest apogee of Ottoman power, cultural influence, political might, economic might. And so it wasn't his contemporaries who named him the Magnificent, but subsequent generations named him the Magnificent. In fact, the Turks called him Kanuni, which means the lawgiver. He was better known as a lawgiver. But at that time, alongside his interest in legal reform, the Ottoman Empire was expanding, or continuing to expand, the impetus that had been given to him by his father. And I think the father-son relationship, when it comes to Suleyman, is very important. Selim the Grim, or Yavuz Selim, as the Turks refer to him, which means trenchant or inflexible, was a monster by many reckonings, by many definitions of the term. He killed so many of his near relations that he had literally no one left apart from young Suleyman to take over from him. He was also intensely interested in war, and he, in the 9 years that he was on the throne, the Ottoman Empire expanded to a greater and faster extent than either before or later. So young Suleyman, when he comes to the throne, his father died probably of the plague in 1520. When he came to the throne, the whole of Europe was thrilled, because they thought that if Selim had remained on the throne, then he would have turned his attention to Western Europe, and Western Europe would have been in acute trouble. And so they didn't know how to appraise this young man of whom they knew little, because princes were sent out to governorships. They were far from the capital, and none of the diplomats had any purchase on who this guy was. Suleyman therefore came to power in a slightly unusual set of circumstances. He didn't have to kill any of his brothers. He didn't have to kill any of his nephews. He didn't have to kill even his father. And Selim had, in fact, killed his own father. He was a regicide, a patricide, nephewicide many times over. And he killed more sons than we can possibly know even existed. He had 10 daughters and 1 son, which tells you something. So Suleyman comes to the throne, and no one quite understands how to read him and how to appraise him. And actually, when you read the early part of Suleyman's life, which is what the Lion House is about, it's essentially a story of young Suleyman, the young Suleyman who comes to the throne, grows into the role, and achieves a position of comfort and a position of serenity within that role, and also starts to leave his mark on the world. That Suleyman is the one that I was trying to tease out and understand. The way I did so was by looking at the people who were around him. And Suleyman came to power when he arrived in Istanbul. He arrived from Manisa, which is where he had been a young prince. He arrived at Istanbul, and he was not alone. There was a young man with him, and he was called Ibrahim, and no one knew who Ibrahim was. And Ibrahim, in fact, had turned out to be someone who had been enslaved at Parga, which is just opposite Corfu in Albania. He had been brought to the Turkish mainland, and he'd been given an education by a Turkish woman of means and substance. And Ibrahim, he hadn't been born Ibrahim, he'd been born Piero. And Piero, who became Ibrahim, was turned into an extremely accomplished young man. And when the prince met this young man, they formed a bond and they formed a friendship, and Ibrahim entered Prince Suleyman's household. When Suleyman acceded to the throne, he went to Istanbul with Ibrahim, and Ibrahim, all the viziers kind of looked around and said, well, who is this guy? We were expecting 1 young man, and we've got 2. And Suleyman had no one else to really look after him. His mother was in the old palace, and she was devoted to him, but he knew, and he knew little of the way that Istanbul worked, little of the way that the corridors of power needed to be negotiated, and he needed this dependent, or he needed this crutch, in fact, and that was what Ibrahim was. And so the machinations against Ibrahim started. The old viziers wanted to control Suleyman, and they couldn't. And gradually Suleyman grew into the role of sultan, and he started to do away with his father's viziers. At the same time, he started to belie all those confident expectations of the Pope and the others in Europe that he would turn out to be a much more emollient sultan than his father had been. And so he took Rhodes and he took Belgrade. And in 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, he obliterated the cream of Hungarian chivalry, and the road to Vienna was open. Now, how did he manage to do this so easily? A way to look at Christianity at the time, or Christendom at the time, is of a house that has been built, that has been roofed by rival roofers, using different materials and laying these materials to different pitches. When they rub up against each other, they're at different angles, and they let in rain. And there are other areas of the roof that are inexplicably left open to the elements. And so the roof of Christendom was leaking. The Ottoman roof, on the other hand, is made by a single architect. It is expandable according to the latest annexation, and it just goes on and on and on. And the architect's design, the grand design of the Ottoman Empire, was conquest, and it was prosperity, and it was pleasing God. And that is something that animated Suleyman, and it animated his father before that. And it was an extremely effective and efficient machine of conquest, administration, and government. We will get on to the whole question of Ottoman tolerance and the way that minorities thrived under the Ottoman Empire, but the initial impulse was one of conquest and acquisition. Christendom, what was happening in Christendom at the time? We have Charles V of the Habsburgs, who also considered himself, like Suleiman, to be a world emperor. But his great rival was Francis I of France. And Francis I of France, despite calling himself the most Christian king, was not averse to getting in bed with the enemy, with the Turks. We also have the Reformation, which is starting to cause intense internal ruptures within Christendom. And Lutheranism is something that the Ottomans were completely aware of, and they were extremely adept at exploiting Lutheranism and the fissures that this created within Christendom. So essentially what happened is that each time the Ottomans marched northwards, the Habsburgs were obliged to give all sorts of concessions to the Lutherans in order that they would send men, or at least refrain from attacking the Habsburgs in the rear. And so the Ottomans and Luther were extremely aware of each other. At one stage, someone came to Suleiman and said, "What do you think of Luther?" And he said, "Well, if he was slightly younger, he would have had in me a very benevolent lord." Now, the Ottomans also were undergoing an inadvertent reformation of their own. That is because from the east, the Iranians were carving out their own religious identity, which we now know as Shi'ism, and these Shia ideas were spreading across Anatolia and towards Istanbul, even as far as the royal family. And so, while this was not a premeditated reformation of the kind that Luther initiated, it was a schism that Suleiman was constantly obliged to pay attention to. Essentially, his life went as follows. He would go north most summers, and he would advance towards Vienna. In 1529, he got to Vienna and he laid siege to Vienna and was only repulsed by the winter weather. But at the same time, he was constantly having to think about his backyard, and he was having to think about what was happening in Iran, and he made several expeditions to Iran in order to smash what they called in those days the red-headed ones. And the red-headed ones were what we now call Shias, and they were called redheads because they wound scarlet cloth around their heads. So he spent the first, he comes to the throne in 1523. In 1536, which is the end point of the Lion House, i.e. the first third of his time in power, we get a sense of Suleiman having reached a position of dominance and power, and he has become an extraordinarily powerful world figure. Now, how do we know Suleiman? How can we possibly get to know Suleiman? An intensely shielded public persona, someone who, even relative to his recent ancestors, appeared less frequently in public. We know what we know about Suleiman largely through foreign diplomatic reports, the letters that he left behind, some fragments of diary, and also the chroniclers who were writing about him at the time. And we also know a fair amount about him through the Persian perspective, so from the Iranian sources as well. And what we come to know about him is this young man initially is utterly dependent on Ibrahim, whom he makes his Grand Vizier. The relationship may well have been physical. It was certainly commented on the time as being one of unusual intensity and closeness, and it caused immense ructions in the Ottoman court. He was breaking all sorts of rules by bringing the private life into the public sphere. At the same time, Ibrahim had presented as a gift to the Sultan a young slave woman who was called Roxolana. She became known as Roxolana, She was born in the Ukraine, and she was acquired in the slave market at Kaffa, or in the northern Crimea, and then she was brought across to Istanbul. She entered the royal harem. She was renamed Hürrem, which means joyful or exuberant, and indeed she was. The name absolutely fitted her, and Suleiman fell in love with her. And so in this early period of Suleiman's reign, we start to see the rivalry between Ibrahim and Hürrem. And Hürrem is, she ends up wiping the floor with Ibrahim. She is one of the most extraordinary people that I've ever read about, let alone written about. If you think of the way that she started her life, Ibrahim started in similar circumstances, but then she actually smashes all the taboos in the Ottoman court. She becomes the first Ottoman consort to actually come and live with the Sultan. She becomes the first consort for generations to marry the Sultan. And she becomes ultimately the first consort for a long time to insist on her husband's monogamy. The way she got him to marry her is an interesting story. She went to the Mufti one day, and we have this from an impeccable source who was there in Constantinople at the time. She went to the Mufti and said, I'm now very rich and I've got lots of children. It's time for me to start being a philanthropist and start building hospitals and hospices. And will that help me in the afterlife? Will that help me get to heaven? And the Mufti shook his head and with great sorrow and said, well, sadly not, because you are a slave. And that will only help your owner. And so for several days, she is anything but joyful and exuberant. And Suleiman, in the end, frees her, and she acquires her freedom. Then he sends her word, and he says, well, how about it? And she says, what do you mean, how about it? Don't you know your own law? A Muslim man cannot couple with a free Muslim woman. A slave is different, but a free Muslim woman, no, unless he's married to her. And so Suleiman marries her. We have about 6 or 8 letters that she wrote to him, and they're just delightful to read. She's asking for things, she's giving him information about the family, about how the children are. There's one child, Jahangir, who's the youngest, who has a double hunchback and is constantly causing her anxiety. Their enormous hope for the future is Prince Mehmet, who shows many of the qualities one would wish for in a future ruler. There are other sons, and then there's a daughter, Mihrimah, who's a complete stunner and is also highly intelligent. And so she's giving him all this information. He's sending, we have a few letters that he sent back from campaign. And so we start to get just a sense of the way that this relationship is going. And it ends in 1536, not the relationship, in fact, it reaches a whole new level with the demise of Ibrahim, with which the Lion House ends. And his demise it's a very interesting way that he gets too big for his boots. Essentially, in the 1530s, as Suleiman is conquering everywhere, and all the diplomats are coming to Ibrahim. Ibrahim's loving it because he's receiving all these gifts. He speaks Italian. They all love speaking in Italian to him. They feel they've got an inside track, particularly the Venetians. He was born a Venetian subject, and so anyone who comes to Istanbul and can play the Venetian card feels that they're very close. And in the end, he starts saying things like, well, it's all very well, the Sultan, but, if he wants something and I say no, it just doesn't happen. And if he has a set of clothes made, I get something even better. And so essentially giving off the impression that power lies with him. And this eventually does get back to Suleiman. Hürrem certainly has a word as well. And so there is this demise. The other thing that I would say in 1536, the other thing that I would say marks this initial third of Suleiman's reign apart from the subsequent periods of the reign, is his relationship with someone called Alvise Griti. And he's another character Ibrahim's hardly been written about. Alvise Gritti has hardly been written about. And Alvise is another just, I mean, it beggars belief, Alvise Gritti. He was the son of the Venetian Doge. The Venetian Doge is Doge Gritti, a man of enormous authority, of great splendor, ambition. But like many Venetians, he'd started life in Constantinople as a trader, as a diplomat, as a spy. And the problem with Alvise, his only real flaw is the fact of his illegitimacy. And a couple of decades before he was born, the Venetian authorities passed a law saying that if someone of illegitimate birth could not achieve a high position in the patriciate. So there's nothing for Alvise to do. So he comes to Istanbul, he makes friends with Ibrahim, Ibrahim introduces him to the Sultan, and presto, Alvise is the number 3 man in the empire. And he does not convert, and this is absolutely crucial. Suleyman was prepared to have someone in his very closest inner circle who had not converted, who retained all the trappings of his Christian background. And Alvise became the Sultan's procurer of gemstones, and this was extremely important. Charles V had been crowned formally by the Pope in Bologna in 1529, and the woodcuts were everywhere, showing him with this great crown, and everyone was saying what an amazing, all the trappings of power. And Ibrahim said to the Sultan, well, you don't have a crown. And of course, everyone around the Sultan was saying, well, we don't do crowns in Islam. It's just not what we do. And Ibrahim said, well, you have to, because everyone expects it. And if they're doing it, if Charles has got a crown, you've got to have a better one. And so a plan is hatched, and we have all the details of this, whereby Suleyman will have a crown that's bigger and better, not only than that of Charles V, but also of than the papal tiara. And it's ordered from a workshop in Venice. It costs 144,000 ducats, which is the cost of an imperial fleet. It is brought, and the gemstones for it are sourced from all around the world, and then it is brought in a sort of meandering fashion through the Balkans with a big, ostentatious guard. And then it's presented to Suleyman. He shows it off in a town called Niš on his way north for one of his Viennese campaigns. And the people of Niš come out to see what's happening, and there are various Habsburg diplomats who have been positioned up minarets so they get the best view. And Suleyman comes through. He can't wear this crown because it's way too heavy. It is brought by his most beautiful pages on a lovely cushion, and that is the only time it's ever seen. Then, towards the end of the Ibrahim period, people start saying, well, it really isn't what we do in Islam, and so it's put to one side and then it's dismantled. But this is the kind of thing that Alvise was doing. He was sourcing these gems, and also he became the kind of forward diplomat for Suleyman with respect to Hungary, with respect to his father. He said, only I can read my father's intentions, you've got to use me. He was sending letters to the Habsburgs saying, I'm still a Christian, you must use me because I'm within the Ottoman system, but I can actually prevent the Ottomans from attacking and creating havoc. Anyway, all of this comes to the end that probably you have foreseen. Around the same time as Ibrahim's debacle, Alvise goes a step too far as well, and he comes to an awkward end. How are we doing for time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Right, okay. So I'll do about 40 years in 10 minutes.
You can take 15 of those questions.
I'm trying to give you an idea of how one would sort of divide up this life if one were writing a trilogy. And I didn't set out to write a trilogy. And I consider myself extremely lucky that the publishing industry, such as it is, the mainstream publishing industry, has given me the license to write not one book, but 3 books about a man no one has ever heard of. And so I think as deeply as I can about what constitutes a trilogy and how one would work a trilogy into something that is pleasing. And I think the first book, I think Young Suleyman, is about power. I think the word power probably recurs about 250 times in that book. It is about the acquisition of power, the trappings of power, the demonstration of power, and ultimately how that power starts to turn your mind. There's Machiavelli is a contemporary, and he's writing about power, and he's writing intelligently about the way that, particularly how a minister and the king or a prince should manage their relations. But what he hasn't thought about in his much more stratified society is what happens when someone comes from nowhere, not from the ranks of the aristocracy or as a high-ranking mercenary or someone who's already achieved prominence, power, position, how someone comes from nowhere to become the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, arguably the second most powerful man in the world. And so this is how Ibrahim, this is a conundrum that Ibrahim doesn't solve and which Hürrem does solve. And so we go into book 2, which could be subtitled The Refulgence, because it's when he's everywhere. Suleiman is literally invading everywhere, but it is essentially about family. And so Hürrem is starting to take control. She's got rid of Ibrahim, and now the big question, in fact it's a curse, is that we've spent our 20s having so many babies, having so much fun, and now only one of them can survive. And there's another complicating factor. Before Hürrem, Suleiman had one of his consorts, his favourite consort was called Mahidevran, who was a Circassian woman. And she gave birth to a prince called Mustafa. And Mustafa is now the oldest surviving son of Suleiman. And the Janissaries, the crack corps that the entire world fears because they're so extraordinarily effective in battle, and also they're extremely disciplined, as well as being highly fanatical. The Janissaries adore Mustafa, and that's an important thing in his favour. If Mustafa comes to the throne and Hürrem is still alive, that means essentially it's curtains for her. Not only curtains for her, but curtains for all of her sons as well, and probably her daughter as well, because that is what happens. When the new guy comes in, he has to clear away all the dead wood. Otherwise, there's all sorts of chances of pretenders coming out of the woodwork, of even if you exile them, it's not a solution. And so book 2 is essentially about the management of family and how Suleiman manages what is essentially becoming a relationship that is dominated by Hürrem. And in order to preserve and maintain her position and to plan for the future, Hürrem forms what might be loosely called a cabal or a triumvirate, with her and Mihrimah, her daughter, whom she marries off to a young rising statesman called Rustem. And Rustem Pasha ends up becoming the Ibrahim Pasha. He becomes the Grand Vizier. But he's also part of this group whose primordial objective is to ensure that Mustafa, the rival son, does not become sultan. And that starts to really, that doesn't just affect the family as you've gone, it affects the whole empire. It affects the subjects and it affects the army. And so by the end of book 2, what you have is this great tension and this great this besetting flaw of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, it has no other flaw in so many respects. It is operating at absolute peak capacity. But this besetting flaw of the Ottoman Empire is they haven't figured out how to deal with the succession, and that starts to infect everything. But as we get to that point, and the end of book 2, The Golden Throne, is when that achieves a certain resolution. not complete resolution, but certain resolution in a very distressing and shocking way. As we get to that point, Suleyman and his admirals and his generals and his commanders are taking over larger and larger swathes of the world. And I'll just give you one sense. I won't go into Hayreddin Barbarossa, the pirate. He deserves a whole lecture on his own. But I will just talk a little bit about an expedition that takes place in 1538. 1538 is an annus mirabilis for the Ottoman Empire. They've got three major campaigns taking place in entirely different theatres. It is something that no other empire in the world could do at the time. One of the leftovers from Selim's regime, Suleiman's father's regime, who doesn't get the job, is a eunuch also called Suleyman, and he's called Hadim Suleyman. And Suleyman, the eunuch, he could go off and just retire and count his money and that sort of thing. But having money doesn't really mean anything when you've got no one to share it with, and you know that when you die, because you're a slave, it will just immediately return to the Sultan's inventory. And he's a very driven man, a very cruel man and a very driven man, the eunuch Suleyman. And it is well known that where the Ottomans have failed is where Vasco da Gama succeeded, is where Columbus succeeded. It's getting out of that wider Mediterranean basin, out of Central Europe, and going much further afield. And so what happens is that in the spring of 1538, Hadim Suleyman, the eunuch Suleyman, has tried to build a canal to link the Nile and Suez. He's tried, but the desert has defeated him. So he's had to drag the ingredients for an armada across the desert to Suez, and there he has built himself an armada, in which he sets off, and he goes down the Red Sea, and he comes round the Gate of Lamentation, which isn't really a gate, but it's widowed and orphaned many. And then he puts in at Aden, and he takes Aden. He's constantly receiving tribute and demonstrations of fealty to the Sultan as he goes. He's entering Portuguese territory now, and he ends up going all the way to Diu, which is in Gujarat. And just think about that for a moment. This does not work out, but imagine if it had. This is 1538, before the East India Company has been thought up. The Portuguese have tenuous toeholds in India, and here the Ottomans are. And of course, the Ottomans are not treated like welcoming heroes when they arrive and say, we're going to save you from the Portuguese. They are also interested in exploiting India and exploiting its peoples. But there is a sense that if you have a Muslim power, and most of the powers in Western India at the time Muslim as well, if you have a Muslim power, it's probably preferable to having the Portuguese, who are busy propagating their Catholic faith. But the eunuch Suleyman doesn't play his hand well, and he annoys all his local allies. And also, he's unaware of exactly when the Portuguese relief force is going to arrive. So in the end, he has to call off the invasion of India for another time. But he has taken Aden on the way. I'm now being reminded that I should stop. So this is 1538 until just to leap forward to his death. Suleyman dies on campaign. He dies campaigning in Hungary. He's a campaigning prince. So that's another extremely important part of his life, and I do go into a certain amount of detail as to how the Ottoman military machine operates and how the logistics are assured, because obviously the logistical challenge is phenomenal. But I'll stop there.
Thanks for listening to and other of our talks from the West Cork History Festival. A reminder that if you'd like to find out more about the festival and listen to other recordings, please go to the website at www.westcorkhistoryfestival.org.